As a presidential candidate in 2016 myself, I've been looking at this decision in Obergefell by the U.S. Supreme Court. Obergefell is one of about four cases which were taken together from various states. And the fundamental question was really, do states have to issue marriage licenses? And that question was never answered. And apparently there is no direction from this Anthony Kennedy decision to tell states they need to issue marriage licenses. And a lot of people now have tried to protect themselves against this overbearing Washington, D.C., and against this court, Supreme Court, which is supposed to be there to protect our rights, but which has been in moral slide for decades. And this is about the low point, really driven by a representative of the Democratic Party, who represents probably the low point, with the exception of those who willingly supported the continuation of slavery, even the importation and breeding of slaves. That was very bad, and I think that a lot of this immorality probably is in fact driven by that period. And with the exception of that, this is probably the low point in the moral standards on the U.S. Supreme Court. It's a purely political move by Obama, who has stacked the court to achieve more promises. He's got a lot of promises that kind of run into each other and create chaos and actually mayhem in our last few years of Barack Obama, and actually down to close to the last year. But some of the things that run together, he promised, he claimed, to bring all the troops home. Well, of course, that hasn't worked. He hasn't brought them home, but a lot of people voted for that because they didn't have to go fight or they didn't know what to do, and they could blame George Bush for it, even though it really is a situation which Bill Clinton has helped to maintain in Iraq. Another promise was that given to homosexuals and lesbians to push their agenda through, although both he and Hillary claimed publicly lied, saying they would not destroy this institution of traditional marriage. They lied, and this is really the moral low point. Now, for many Americans, we take refuge in this great country's beacon of liberty and freedom, that we can have freedom of conscience. There's been cases in which freedom of conscience has even been taken seriously, especially some that come to mind during the Vietnam War, when they had to resolve the issue of conscientious objectors. And freedom of conscience was strongly protected there in some cases. And freedom of religion. There's just a lot of people who realize that they don't have all the answers themselves, or even possibly from their family and community, and maybe even their church. They realize they need guidance in right and wrong. As an example of the moral slide of the legal community, there's a person that I mentioned in some of my other videos named George Newman. He's got a number after it because he apparently, there's so many new men. I think he's 62. They're part of the new history. It's maybe like Nietzsche, the Superman, George Newman, maybe George Superman. George Superman is a lawyer, one of those who kind of throws elections and gets involved in the courts to see who's going to get seated. Very important for the two national parties, Democrats and Republicans, to sort out who gets seated and to get going in their agenda and see what they're going to do with $3 to $4 trillion a year. Sorry. And George Newman and I were talking on Twitter about this decision. He claims to be an expert in this and really strongly coming after me in the Al Franken case. And I told him at one point that my main concern right now, and I'll talk about some of the other concerns I have about human rights, but my main concern was that parents be able to teach their children right and wrong. We used to have a song that a lot of people in my generation really like. It was, "Teach the children well." And I think everybody still kind of believes in morality. They want the children to be taught what's right because they don't know. The children don't know. The normal pattern for all human behavior is to do what feels good versus doing what you're told to do by the parents because you don't know. And they want you to do certain things, and you learn those things, and you start to do those things, and sometimes it becomes complicated. But a child needs to learn right and wrong. And right now, we see how important this is, to have that ability to make moral judgments in your own life And the way we have had it set up, just because we know everyone is not going to agree at all times what is right and wrong. And so traditionally, this country is founded on freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. The individual has a strong, compelling right to do what they think is right. And they have a right, and a right is something, it's a name that's been used, and it secures your freedom of action as against the government coming in and telling you what you have to do. Now, there's other kinds of rights. You can enter into agreements with other people, and somebody can find that you've given someone else a right under that. They have a contractual right. But here we're talking about constitutional rights and also statutory rights. But the basic one is constitutional rights, that we're so aware that the government has power to destroy those rights and force you to do what they command you to do, that we have secured those in our Constitution. And two of the essential ones are the right of freedom of conscience, freedom and right of conscience, and the right of religion, freedom to exercise. What it says is you're free to exercise your religion. And this is a big problem today. It really needs to be understood. And so George Newman, the Superman, who's licensed in Virginia, Washington, D.C., and Maryland to practice the high-power, highly paid election law in demand, no doubt, by the parties, he told me that if I believed that a parent needed to have the ability, the right to teach their children right from wrong, this man, he doesn't just say, well, no, Steve, it takes a village. What he says is, you're a bigot. That proves that you're a bigot. If you have children and you teach them how to act, you teach them, even in the area, at some point of their young and growing sense of their body, and at some point you teach the children right and wrong. For instance, you don't go over and start invading and violating some other child's space, either with force or with relations that are a kind of a sensual nature. You don't go do that to other kids. That's one of the things that kids need to be taught. There's other things they need to be doing with their lives than the baser impulses. But this man says, teach your children right from wrong. That's bigotry. And there's even moves to outlaw it. And how did it come to this? And so it happens that I'm actually in a position to know about a lot of this political history, although I couldn't see all the pieces. A lot of this was done at the Minnesota legislature. And so a good clue might be this. We have John Roberts, Chief Justice John Roberts, who has dissented in Obergefell. But a lot of people are very disappointed with him because he has a kind of a moral compass problem. And this is the kind of thing that happens to many people who get involved in politics and who get involved in the law and even acquire great power, that they wield great power in the realm of the law. What the Bible says is the powers and principalities of darkness. And what does this mean? I mean, this is an excellent example. Why is this an example? Because the people who have come adrift from their moral compass, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's some great power that floats around and attacks you in the night or something. But the principalities and powers of darkness are quite clear. We all know what principalities and powers are. We see them. We see them on TV, or somebody writes about them in the newspapers. And in our society, they're people to whom we have entrusted responsibility. And our form of government seeks to hold them accountable so that we can protect our rights. And we have a stable government, and one in which we can have the greatest freedom and liberty and actually quality of life, prosperity, and even advancement of science and technology. And they're right in our Constitution, and they're intended by our government. And in order to do that, we have to have accountability of people who exercise power, those principalities and powers. Now, how do they become a principality and power of darkness? Well, they're benighted. B-E-N-I-G-H-T-E-D. It doesn't mean that they're knighted by the king or queen. It means they're benighted. They're full of darkness. Their minds are darkened. And we fight against that. This is what we fight against right now. What I mean by benighted is they get above their ability and they can't figure out what's right and wrong. Their moorings are adrift. And so we have to fight against that right now. And for that, we need to put on the full armor. We need to have our knowledge. We need to have our will that is looking for the right. We look to God to tell us how we're supposed to act and how we're supposed to will, what we're supposed to want. So we see here in the intersection of religion, but in terms of the faith that this country was founded on, and it was, we see the intersection of the fight with the principalities and powers of darkness. And John Roberts is an excellent example. So John Roberts brought up this question, and he said, what would happen if we begin this equality in which we're defining a new marriage, which is different than the last 2,000 years? Anthony Kennedy is one of those who changed his position. In oral argument, he said, you're asking us to change an institution which has been defined not by us for 2,000 years of human history. Apparently, he was referring to Christianity. And maybe that should have tipped us off that no, he's not going to let them stand just because it's been out there for 2,000 years. But John Roberts was also looking for moral grounds. And again, these powers and principalities, they become benighted because of the fact that they reach a position, especially when they have lifelong tenure, they can never be removed by anybody, and sometimes it appears under any circumstances. And so, as Lord Acton said, that absolute power that it becomes corrupts absolutely. The only check on a justice, if they want to be on the winning side, is the other 8 justices. Nobody else can tell them what to do. You can take that too far, and there have been some instances in which they have been told what to do, but basically politicians who make the law, judges who are free to make any decision that they want, subject only to appeal, have to start to rely on a moral compass, to agree to give effect to the law and Constitution. And in this case, they've created new law. And this is one of the things that happens when there's no check, what we call checks and balances. And so John Roberts was benighted, and he put in the opinion and argument that he hoped would shed some light on the subject, to lead the other powers and principalities out of their darkness. And one of those things was a thing called polyamorism. And today I read the Washington Post, an article by someone who's made her living. She does nothing now but write about gender and cultural change. That's her beat for the Washington Post. And she was offended that people identified her giving ammunition against the cause to Chief Justice Roberts, that she so ardently supports. Her name, I believe, is Jessica Bennett. I hope I have that right. So I've worked in journalism, and it's another one of those jobs where you have responsibility under the First Amendment, just like the judges, just like the politicians. You're given a lot of freedom and liberty under that. And she has that freedom and liberty. She speaks of fighting with her editor. Her editor used to make her, for anybody knows anything about journalism, her editor used to make her get a quote from the other side of the issue. It wasn't news, it was issues, political ideas. She had to include a quote that she didn't agree with. Here's a so-called journalist, supposed to be fair and balanced, but she refused to give quotes from the other side. And she had a fight with her editor, and she said she lost. She included the quote of somebody who had their own freedom of conscience on what's right and wrong, and decided that when addressing issues of morality, that they wanted it included. She didn't want it included. So she said the next fight she won. She was allowed not to include views that she didn't want, and now today we have newspapers announcing to their readers not to send in letters for publication that offend the new normal, the new people who feel that lesbians and homosexuals have equal rights to marry, but they determine that as marry according to their own behavior at the time, which is something that we want to teach our children not to do. If we think that we disagree with that, with homosexuality, we want to teach them not to do that. And so this woman wrote an article that was used by John Roberts to give him a moral compass, if you can imagine that. And his moral compass these days is just that. Well, wait a minute. Now that Anthony has abandoned his respect for the institution of marriage, and he's going to redefine it because of what he thinks is right and wrong, and I'm going to give a little bit later some of the things that might be driving Anthony Kennedy on this issue, but Roberts had to try to put out some moral guideposts. And what he put out there was this article by Jessica Bennett. And Jessica Bennett is offended by this and wanted to be the first to write in the Washington Post that she did not mean to offend all of her subjects in that article, who were what is called, and this is a new one to many people, I was unaware of the trend, it's called polyamorous. So, okay, we've got monogamy, which is you remain committed and faithful to your spouse of the opposite sex. That's what it's always meant. Now homosexuals want to adopt that to give them legal benefits, and it's going to cause legal chaos, as I'll explain. And then you've got polygamy as opposed to monogamy. And polygamy is a marriage, but it is a marriage to, well, it's multiple marriages. And I guess traditionally it's been a man having many wives. And it's an ancient practice. You'll find it in the Bible itself, in the Old Testament. But by the New Testament, you find Christ talking about marriage and divorce laws. And it's obvious that polygamy is not allowed. It's become adultery. And under the legal code then could result in death. And we see that throughout the world today, a lot more in the papers. And so now we got this new thing called polyamorous. We've got monogamy, polygamy, and now polyamorous. I guess that's many loves. Now, in the particular polyamorous situation Jessica Bennett looked at, it's very complicated. It reminds you of Berkeley, California or something. These people had to move to Seattle. And apparently there was one woman at the center of it and a married couple, man and woman, just on the other side of the block. And the woman had two men who would live with her as if they were her husbands, and apparently they would rotate. And then in addition, the married wife was also having sexual relations with those two men from next door, and the husband was also dating the woman at the center of the three-way next door. I guess to a lot of people who don't have much sense, that would seem pretty cool. And John Roberts asked, well, what if that's next? What would be the argument to say that they can't enter into at least a contract, I'm sure they wouldn't want to, but that they might not now claim married rights? So, okay, for example, in this case, the woman says, I'm not married, but I'm filing my taxes, and I'm asking for all kinds of, let's say you want part of the estate, which is really how this all got started. Justice Ginsburg, then a lawyer, and she's a favorite of Hillary and Bill Clinton, and she argued Reed versus Reed, the first case in which women could not be excluded by men from being the executress of an estate. For some states, there are laws like that. She got those struck down. And so it comes to be about money. And what if the polyamorous wanted to get a piece of that estate? Let's say the woman with the two guys who alternatively lived with her, and they say there was plenty of money involved in this arrangement, so it could well arise that somebody could want a piece of that estate of the married couple. So you'd have a situation, and we're going to see this now with this new rule. We're going to see homosexual and lesbian lovers coming in, competing with the family. I guess starting in the hospital where their partner appears to be dying, and so right away they're in there, being there, getting access to that money under the law of marriage before could not go anywhere but the rightful heirs. So they're trying to get that money that before they could not get. And so people are going to be claiming that they're rightful heirs because they live next door, for instance. They had a relationship with the husband, which wasn't marriage, but they're going to want that. They're going to want a state to pass that. I can see it happening in, for instance, Colorado and Seattle. California might be harder. It's more populated, might be more resistance. But this is the kind of thing people are concerned about. So how do we get there? Well, I happen to know a little bit about that. Because when I came back from the end of the Vietnam War, I attended the University of Minnesota. And I decided to get involved in organized government. I wouldn't say so much politics. I just wanted to get right into the government. And one of the things I wanted to do was fight against the exclusion of, not only the exclusion of non-white races, but of the cultural, especially major cultural groups, which I could see were dividing America. It turns out, since I came from the Asian situation, unlike Barack Obama, who really migrated toward the black-white thing in Hawaii after he settled down, he did spend some time in Indonesia, and I'm sure that shaped him. But as an adult, I had seen the Vietnam War and had wondered why this had happened. And a lot of atrocious things happening. We lost 50,000 American lives, many, many wounded, many lives destroyed. The Vietnamese lost infinitely more. And I learned a lot. I was a Vietnamese linguist, and I learned a lot just by being there. And I came back, and I wanted to learn how we could not have a society limited by race as we did, including, but not just, the black-white thing. That's a big thing. But there's also the Indian thing. There's the Hispaniola thing, Mexico and the territories of Spain. And there's the Asian thing. And I won't get into it all, but I began to work through the government to recruit. And I went to the student centers and invited them into the government. Each one of these groups had a student center at the University of Minnesota. That's what I did in 1977. So I'm way ahead of the field, I think, in looking at integration of race and culture. I can tell about some of my other work in that area, but what I'm saying now is I came back to work in government. And so what happened was I met a person only one time. He was introduced to me in a kind of a dinner, I guess, who had been the student body president while I was overseas. I wasn't actually in Vietnam. So while I was serving during that Vietnam War, this guy was working with the people leading them to fight against the war in massive protests at the U of M, University of Minnesota. I wasn't there. I was using the Vietnamese language to help our side in a war. And he was over here fighting against the military. He was also very popular, but he was also a homosexual, and I was introduced to him as such. And you may have heard of him, of his case, of Jack Baker. He went to law school, and what he was doing, and he was using his law school knowledge to overturn the denial of marriage licenses to people who were homosexual. He was in a homosexual relationship, him and another man, and he was suing the state of Minnesota in a federal court. I don't know if he had any state court action, but he sued them in a federal court to give him a license. And in fact, he never got that license, not in those proceedings. And the case went to the Eighth Circuit, U.S. Court of Appeals. And they had various legal arguments why they denied and dismissed his case. And I believe he did not get certiorari at the U.S. Supreme Court. But I met this guy, and I listened to what he had to say, and I didn't really agree with him. Probably I thought it was interesting that he would try to look for his rights in the Constitution. So way back then, I became aware of him, Jack Baker, and it really wasn't one of my central concerns. Then again, in the 1980s, when I was even more involved, I was notified because I was in the U of M, which was a huge campus. It was the largest one in the country. And I was mostly involved in trying to improve access and the educational experience and to improve the learning that we could have from learning the true knowledge of other races and cultures here in the United States, in addition to the ivory tower of European and Western knowledge, which I admire very much, but I don't think that it is enlightened to exclude the other actual knowledge of other races and cultures here in the United States. But so it was brought to my attention that outside the university in St. Paul, there was an ordinance being voted on. And I think they called it the Human Rights Ordinance. But they felt that that ordinance would allow people to lose their jobs, their housing, possibly certain benefits. A lot of things could be lost because they were exposed as a homosexual. So that's where we were at that time. And you can see I understand the problems which arise. And so I founded a political party. Went to the office of sort of like our Secretary of State at the university and filled out a paper with, I believe, 2 other individual students. And we founded the Human Rights Party. And the reason it was called the Human Rights Party was one of the issues that we wanted to address was this ordinance. And I believe we wanted it defeated because it would result in the loss of these liberties and rights based on being a homosexual or a lesbian. So I was actually in this party working for this. So a prominent homosexual activist visited the office of our government, basically those of us in the university senate who were elected from the students. Quite a large body, I think 40 or 50 people. And he asked for me by name. And he asked me, would I ride in, I believe it was the first Gay Pride Parade, which they organized. And I listened to what it was about, and I thought, well, if this would support people getting their basic human rights, I would do that. I mean, this seemed to have a purpose at that time. Now you look at these parades, you wonder, what is the purpose of this? I told him I'm straight. I have no interest in any of your lifestyle, but I think you should have human rights. So I will ride in your parade. So I rode down the parade, I think in the lead car with him. I think he was possibly the organizer of the first one. And I rode with him and addressed a rather large crowd. I would say there were definitely hundreds, probably 500 or 600 at the culmination of that. And I told them, I'm straight, but I don't believe that you should lose human rights. Now, today they would say, well, a human right would be to call our relationships marriage. I wasn't talking about that. At that time, no one had raised it to me. But there was another event that was on the campus in which there was a discussion, and a man named Alan Speer, who was a Minnesota senator, kind of like Clementa Pinckney in South Carolina, and evidently one of the big political organizers of this whole movement that you now see. This was back in the 80s, so he's passed away. But I also listened to what he had to say, because one of the things that had failed at the legislature of Minnesota was this state was one of the states that if you were a homosexual, that was a felony. If you engaged in sodomy, which is what homosexuals do, I guess, and that was a felony. You go to prison because of that. And so people were, they called it in the closet. But the closet was not so much that they were necessarily ashamed or embarrassed or anything like that, so you're hiding in the closet. The closet was, you come out and they find that you were involved in sodomy, you're going to prison. So people were basically, frankly, terrified of being discovered and that this would be done to them, and this was Minnesota state law. And they had a decriminalization bill which Speer brought up. And I read about that. I suppose it was covered in the Minnesota Daily. And so in the discussion afterwards, I asked Alan Speer, who was also the chair of the political science department, and I was a political science major and economics major. Those were my majors. So I'd heard of Alan Speer and listened to what he said. Here I was a student, about mid-20s, older than the other students, having come back from service in the Vietnam War theater. I talked to Alan Speer, and I asked him a question. And I said, are you going to bring a bill again this year to try to overturn that law again, so that people will not be subject to criminal prosecution for sodomy? Because what I was thinking is, that's harsh. I'm sure that Anthony Kennedy thinks that's harsh, and a lot of people think it's harsh, because in about 1995, and another case just slightly earlier, those two cases together have been used to make it unconstitutional for states to do that to people for sodomy. And I felt that a state doing that was really persecuting somebody who I just think is harsh. And there were some basic, very basic constitutional issues right there in that case. And so Alan Speer comes back to me, and a lot of people there I noticed were watching very closely, and he said, one of the things we're thinking of doing is creating a thing called, I believe they were all already using the term gay at that point, which I didn't agree with because I don't see anything gay about it, but a thing called gay marriage. A thing called marriage where the relationship would be treated as marriage instead of being treated as a crime. And he asked me what I thought about that. And so I told him, well, I don't think it would be marriage, but it's interesting. Maybe you could do something of a civil nature, a contract, some other relationship. So the conversation stopped there, and I never really heard that much more about it. And so I had occasion to work with some of the other professors there who were lesbians. I didn't know this. They didn't come and tell me this. And these people have been involved in the Minnesota legislature in the very same work as it advanced. And again, I'm not against human rights and the denial of civil rights to people for this. I don't favor that. But one other thing also happened after the criminalization of sodomy, which is obviously a form of persecution, or would definitely allow for persecution, blackmail and the like, where somebody's going to be imprisoned if others find out. In addition to that which was lifted, I think, was in Roper v. Evans, dated about 1995, and Anthony Kennedy wrote that opinion. There had been another one called Lawrence versus Texas, in which the Supreme Court kept telling the states, no, you cannot pass laws to put people in prison for sodomy. Not that I agree with it. I think, to me, it's obviously perversion. I think many right now watching these parades now would say, I think that's perversion. But the other thing that happened was AIDS. And that's just terrible. It's horrendous. It's one of these viruses, as everybody knows, that began with HIV and then got into full-blown AIDS. It killed a lot of people. It's really, my sense is that it's kind of like a slow motion Ebola. It's just a lot of destruction. Again, I'm not a doctor and I don't know the full progression of that disease. What I do know is the numbers of people that it took, people who worked in the creative field, and many fields. And one of the primary ways people got it in the United States was through homosexual contact. And one can see how the kind of relationships that people would have, especially when they couldn't, like I say, a lot has changed right now, but then they couldn't be public and open about their relations with other people, relationships. So it could spread very quickly. They had multiple partners and this kind of thing, and they thought they were basically just having fun, satisfying their sensual pleasures like many people do, not just homosexuals. Heterosexuals do the same thing. And when I talk about the Bible tries to guard us from sin, including these sins, because of their destructive nature. People growing up don't understand. They don't know about it. They get into it. It's too late. There are many things like this that the Bible guards us against. So this would expose them to AIDS. So it's a terrible disaster and one of the great tragedies of American life that took a lot of people. I don't believe nearly as many as abortion, but it's part of the same pattern of engaging in sin and a tremendous loss of human life in America. It kind of tells us that we need to turn to God to listen, to learn, and then there's lots of people who get sick of hearing that, but I think it's usually because they don't understand it. They don't believe it, but once they do, they feel saved. Salvation is a truly wonderful thing, and that's what's needed. So these are some of the things that I think caused this strong movement. Obviously, people hated those who put them in prison. They hated those who didn't care about their suffering and their AIDS. They hated those who said that their lifestyle is abnormal, needs to be treated as illness. And people hated that. Does that mean that it was horrible? I don't think in itself that advising people to live a moral life is a horrible thing to do. As a matter of fact, it's badly needed. And in our system of government, the freedom of conscience and religious liberties and the right to exercise your religion, the Free Exercise Clause, is in the First Amendment, as well as the prohibition against the state establishing a religion. And so we are really in an excellent position to be able to learn morals and ethics and actually to incorporate those into the function of our government. And I think that's what we're trying to do. But we need to stay on course, on track, and not get into trying to take over the government and impose new viewpoints on the population that are supposed to be protected by freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. Can you imagine an autocracy in which these kinds of forces were unchecked and people would have no protection against a very powerful, rich person where they had no rights, who could exploit them sexually as a kind of a throwaway object? The kind of thing that you often hear people talk about, that it's not really love, they're just the object of lust. And so, don't we need to be protected against this by learning right and wrong? It seems to me obvious that we do. We do need to be protected. And so what we need to do is allow that religious liberty to stay alive. There's a lot of hate on the side of the homosexuals and lesbians because of what they've been through. They've now joined up with Barack Obama, who kind of combines all of these things, and yet who he and Hillary, until this movement came about, said that they were absolutely opposed to anybody messing with marriage between a man and a woman. And really, only a minority of the states have agreed to change their laws or been somehow hoodwinked, like we were in Minnesota, into changing our laws. And the rest has been federal judges. There's no doubt that this is a tremendous overreach by those principalities and powers of darkness, the benighted principalities and powers. And I say of darkness because they are benighted, because they have no moral bearing and no idea what America is founded on and what is necessary for America to stay a going concern, to continue to exist, and particularly in this harsh world, in which many people on the planet do look to us to show them how freedom can accommodate freedom of conscience and religious liberty, so that diversity can occur and all of us can contribute what is best from our culture and our faith, and don't need to be worried that people from other faiths are going to kill us, okay? And the world wants that. They want freedom to exercise their conscience. And under our Constitution, our faiths have allowed us to acquire freedom of conscience and to use it, and we need that. But it wasn't always the case. In the early colonies, many of them were very rigid authoritarian as part of their powers to enforce a particular religious belief in their colony under their charter. And the colonies had different religions. And so when the First Amendment was written, they did put in protection of freedom of conscience. So you could not be forced to agree with someone else's religion. And you would not have one religion that forced you to, against all other religions, follow it as the official religion of the state, which would result in tremendous mayhem in our experiences in Europe. And so it's a very key provision. And in Minnesota, we have something called freedom of conscience. It's in our Bill of Rights. Minnesota has a Bill of Rights, and Section 16 is freedom of conscience. You can't force people to support a church. You can't force people to believe in the church, to take an oath in order to be in the government. And it goes so far as to say that this freedom of conscience cannot ever be used to justify licentiousness. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court, in effect, has just nullified our Minnesota Constitution, protection of freedom of conscience, and liberties on freedom of conscience. And I believe that forcing people to give up their children to be taught licentiousness violates the Minnesota Constitution as well as the First Amendment. And we're going to have to continually address this. And in this campaign for president and for Congress, and I think throughout all the states, it definitely is a major issue. And we should address it. We should look at ways to protect freedom of conscience. And I believe that this all occurred because in the case of Jack Baker, he wanted marriage licenses. Since marriage licenses were going to be issued, he wanted one too. We need to stop issuing marriage licenses. We don't want to do that to somehow ban homosexuality or any kind of contracts that they might want to live under. But we need to do it to stop the government from tinkering, from interfering in our freedom of conscience, freedom to exercise our religious beliefs. And so I would support legislation to do this. I would support a constitutional amendment. And in the meantime, I believe that all states have to get out of the marriage license business just to protect our basic freedoms. Because now it's being used by political extremists as part of an overall attack on our way of life and our freedoms and liberties. We want to respect the rights of others. We want to help others to have a chance to succeed, because when they succeed, we all succeed. But we don't want an overpowering federal government aligned with powers and principalities of darkness in the courts all the way up to the morally decadent U.S. Supreme Court. What we want is to maintain the freedom and liberties that God gave us. I'm Steve Carlson. I'm running for President of the United States in 2016. An independent candidate from Minnesota. Thank you for listening.